He did it perfectly. So now we have 15 minutes in order to have questions. No, please, questions from the research group, but also questions from the people that we invited to listen to this talk, please. So raise your hand and... Yeah.
I have two questions with regard to your research. I found it very interesting to hear that live transmission of a play is found to be a complement to theater attendance. But I'm wondering, what's the relationship with movie viewing in a cinema? Would it not substitute away some of the consumption of movies? And whether you have looked at this as well. And the second question is, I'm really looking much forward to your study on the role of proximity to a theater and how it might be positively related to attendance. But I'm wondering how you plan to deal with self-selection. So obviously people who are keen on theater, they might choose to live in proximity to a theater venue.
Yeah, so substitution for movie attendances, that's an eminently testable proposition. So if it had been the case that a group of cinemas had partnered up with the National Theatre to bid to the R&D fund, personally I would have found that a very interesting project. We haven't looked at that. Anecdotally, the cinemas themselves, if you look at those chains, because it tends to be it originally started off being the art house chains, like the Picture House Cinema chain, which was involved heavily with the broadcast, and you can think of that as being a selection bias, because those art house cinemas tend to be located in demographics where people are likely to engage with theatre. That said, from our point of view, the research question was cannibalisation, so it's whether people actively chose to forego a trip to the theatre to go to the cinema, and that required there to be, you have to think that those areas were located with populations where there was a bias to choose cinema over theatre, and because we justified that, as we felt that wasn't a first order bias, we felt that it was still a valid experiment to do what we did. But anecdotally, the cinemas seem to be doing very well out of it. They often time these productions or agree dates for productions not like on a Saturday evening, although sometimes they are beginning to do that as well. So they tend to choose days which might not otherwise sell out. I generally don't know, although anecdotally it seems that the prior is that it may not be a big effect, but it can be researched. The self-selection biases, look, I don't know. I mean, we're still working out what models to estimate with this data. The big challenge really was just getting a hold of this data, because it was held in different venues, and we've had to integrate with a technology partner different booking systems to try and get this data and then match it. So I'm very concerned about self-selection biases. I'm also concerned about the self-selection bias that arises from the fact that venues that participate in NT Live are obviously going to not be random, right? And I'm still trying to get my head around how significant that bias is going to be. So if people have got thoughts on this, it's a very active, and if people are interested in this study, as I said, and have got ideas how to analyse the data, I mean, we're not funding. I'm doing this research in-house with an economist, so there's no funding issues as such. If anyone's interested, let me know, right? We can talk.
And by the way, this is online first in the Journal of Cultural Economics, right? So we have access.
Yeah, there is a study that's published, and Culture of Innovation has a bit more detail as well on the report. And there's a paper which looks at more the survey data in IJCP with David Throsby in last year or so. It's one of the things, not being an academic institution, you actually, I mean, it came online these days, things seem to come online so quickly these days, but I don't, I'm not sure where.
I highly recommend that you follow NESTA's publication.
I'm really interested in using controlled experiments, by the way, to try and get a hold of, if anyone's interested in that area, I'm very keen to connect with researchers that are interested in random assignment and in the cultural area, because NESTA's got a big interest in that sort of methodology. It addresses some of the methodological challenges about endogeneity, and I've seen it work in other areas. I've run RCTs in other areas where it's worked a dream, so I would love to explore its use in the cultural sector.
Another one, Isidoro.
I'm very sorry because I couldn't follow completely the presentation without the slides, but I have one question. I think at some point you said that there was an indication of either willingness to pay or some value given to socialization or...
Oh, yeah.
So can you repeat the point?
Yeah, so, I mean, this was very tentative, this part of the analysis. We haven't probed it very deeply, and it was fairly unsophisticated what we did, but essentially what we did was, introduced a series of attitudinal questions, which you'll be aware if you look at the literature on trying to measure the intrinsic value of live performance art. These questions have been used before. We asked a series of different questions about how people valued or not the experience, ranking from 1 to 5 using Likert scale type questions. And one of the questions, I think we actually had 3 different questions which were trying to get the extent to which people value enjoying the experience in a social context. And what you found is that other things being equal, when you basically try and explain willingness to pay from all the usual determinants, income, age, etc., there seem to be 2 or 3 rather robust results that seem to show up time and time again in the data. Correlation, causation, I don't know, but and one of them was the social dimension. We found that in a different study with the Tate, which I didn't discuss here as well, but what we found was that if you survey online visitors to an online exhibition, and compare their responses with people who actually went to an exhibition at the museum, at the gallery, in this case Tate Liverpool, again, what you found with other things being equal, people's valuation of enjoying a social experience seemed to show up in their willingness to pay, which seems quite intuitive, but we never studied it any further.
But do you explore somehow or verify whether people could go there just because they have a better audio and video?
Yeah, well, certainly there were some questions, actually, very basic questions. I think this is the most
proximity thing that before going very far away, I go there because I get better. It's the same thing with the television and the cinema.
Yeah, there was evidence to suggest. So there were certainly some questions directly asked about proximity to the screen, for example. I mean, if you're closer to the screen, you can much likely, to other things being equal, engage with what you're experiencing. There was evidence for that.
Not in the cinema. In the cinema, you don't want to be too close to the screen.
Well, the fact that wherever you were in the cinema, your proximity to the screen meant that, so it wasn't a question about variation within the cinema. Wherever you sit in the cinema, you were close to the screen. Within the theatre, we asked the same questions to theatre audiences, and you do see this, although that appears not to explain all of the variation in willingness to pay. So we put that variable into the model as well, for what it's worth. It's just OLS, and what you find is it doesn't drive the results, but it's certainly there in the data that people value seeing.
When you speak about live streaming, do you also include the streaming through the net?
Yeah,
and not only the streaming through the theatre, the cinemas.
Yeah. So these were satellite broadcasts to digital cinemas.
Yeah.
I did try and persuade the National Theatre with Frankenstein to try and do a live streaming online, because I felt that by having a free online experience, they may be able to address some of the meet theatre novices. I wanted to test the proposition whether the way that they could actually engage with very low income audiences that had no previous experience of theatre was by doing free streaming. But interestingly, they agreed to it. It was the cinemas who were worried that it would cannibalise the live screenings at the cinema, so it got kicked out. But we have funded 1 or 2 projects which have tried to do that. The problem is, as anyone knows working in the cultural sector, it's very difficult, to predict what's going to be a cultural success. In both cases, the experiences have tanked. They've not been popular with audiences, and therefore the data has not been that interesting. It's a fundamental problem we have in the R&D fund when we do these sorts of experiments. If the experience doesn't work, I've got this big project in China I'm doing at the moment with a very well-known British novelist, David Mitchell. It's a wonderful experiment. No one's buying the stories. Even though it's David Mitchell, no one's buying it, so I'm not getting enough data to actually...
Yeah, the FEDR experiment is the only one you did run, and I have 2 sub-questions. Why did you choose FEDR, which is really not an easy play? I never saw it. I don't think I would like to see it either in the theater or as a movie. And I mean, suppose you only run it once, this experiment. So how can you conclude about what would happen if you run this every other week? Do you think it would work, or was it just because it was a one-time event that people would go and then see, how does this look? And once they saw how it looked, they are not going to go again.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So we chose FEDRA because it was the first of the 4. They had 4 productions in their pilot season, and this was the first one. So everything was set up because even the selection of the cinemas was part of the research design. So it was natural to go with the first one. We were concerned about external validity of the results, as you are with any experiment, whether it's controlled or not. I mean, how do you know whether it would be repeated elsewhere? We did do we did replicate most of the analysis with the second production, All's Well That Ends Well. So it was a very, very different production, a Shakespeare production. Very, very similar results, almost down to a T. I mean, slightly worryingly similar results. I just thought, my guess, my prior was that different in production would have different impacts. It goes without saying, the only really way to address this is to repeat this sort of research. And the frustrating thing is it's quite cheap to do. We've designed the surveys. The experimental data is being collected anyhow. They collect it in their marketing data. It's trivial to do this repeat analysis. It's just that, well, not trivial, but it's relatively straightforward. The problem is actually trying to create, the National Theatre has not off its own back funded this research. I would have been open to an application from the National Theatre, but you can imagine that the other assessors around the table would think, well, this isn't original enough research. They've done the research now. But the only way to do it is to test it again. For what it's worth, anecdotally, because I've been tracking this very closely because of my research interest in it, my feeling, one of the reasons why there was this massive difference between the experience that cinema audiences said that it had compared with theatre audiences, this idea of beyond live, that they were each getting more out of the experience than theatre audiences, was partly because it was a novel experience. I mean, it was a very strange night. I was with David Throsby in my hometown in East Finchley, and people, don't know whether to clap or not. They don't know. I mean, it's if there are mistakes on, because technical problems. How do people respond? I think it's a testable proposition to try and see, and you need to do some qualitative work as well to go alongside this to really get at this. But to see whether that, over time, the more people have got familiar with these experiences, has it been the case, other things being equal, that gap has come down? I think it probably has done. Because it was a very early experience, and it's very frustrating when this question comes up. I keep on thinking I should just take 6 months out of NESTA or a year out of NESTA and go. And I've lobbied the National Theatre, but the problem is that unless they run with it, it's like for me, I've got other things on. I haven't done it, but it's a very eminently testable proposition. And if someone wants to do it, as I said, let me know, right? Because the only reason I haven't done it is scale. It's just me, in this particular project, it's me and David. David lives on the other side of the world. Logistics, we tried to do it in Sydney with the Sydney Theatre Company because he knows Kate Blanchett well. That didn't work. Because there are big rights issues around these experiments, by the way. I mean, one of the reasons why doing this was difficult and why my project with David Mitchell in China is so disappointing is I spent about 2 years with David Mitchell negotiating the rights to actually make available the content, because they're short stories in the China case, and we've made available that content through a social network in China, and we're doing analysis about how the Chinese public engage with this work. And it's partly research questions around how much revenue you can make through ebooks. It's partly about trying to understand the subtleties of Chinese preferences for British culture. And just the idea is very simple, but just clearing the rights was a nightmare.
It's French.
I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm talking, but yeah, this is the TED Hughes translation. I was talking about the China. I shouldn't have talked about China project. I didn't present it, but there's a project that I'm very much involved with at the moment, which is having similar problems.
So, we have time for a last question? No. So, thank you very much. Actually, your presentation was like the good compliment. Well, much better than reading any of your research.
Oh, good.
Yes, like the live performance. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you.